and it may be a long time. So I'm going to change unilaterally the title to say European Defence in the Light of the War in Ukraine, and then we can talk about what comes afterwards as well. My name's Paul Taylor. I'm a columnist with Politico and a senior fellow at Friends of Europe, a think tank in Brussels for whom I've written a series of reports on European security and defense topics, and I'm now working on one on the Western Balkans. In a previous life, I spent 40 years as a foreign correspondent for Reuters, covering war, peace, diplomacy, and a bit of economics. So I'm delighted to be here. I live in France. I have dual French and British citizenship, which is almost the definition of schizophrenia. Nathalie Loiseau, our distinguished member of the European Parliament, doesn't quite have that problem. She has French citizenship only, although she did once claim that she had a cat called Brexit. And she said she'd named her cat Brexit because it meowed all the time to go out. But when she opened the door for it to go out, it stood there looking undecided about whether it wanted to leave or not, and went on meowing anyway. Unfortunately, when the media showed too much interest in the story, Nathalie had to admit that the whole thing had been a joke and there was no cat. This is a version of Boris Johnson's dead fish tactic of putting a dead fish on the table to distract attention from other news. Nathalie is, as you probably know, is chair of the European Parliament's Subcommittee on Security and Defence and a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. She's also a member of the Special Committee on Foreign Election Interference in Europe, which is an interesting subject in itself. She was previously Minister of European Affairs in President Macron's government, and she was, when we first met, in fact, she was director of ENA, the French École Nationale d'Administration, Civil Service High Flyers College, which has been abolished or reincarnated under a different name. And before that, she was very active in the French Foreign Service. Our other speaker is Jana Puglierin, head of the European Council on Foreign Relations office in Berlin. And Jana has been in that role since 2020. Before that, she headed the Alfred Oppenheimer Center for EU Policy at the German Council on Foreign Relations, the DGAP, which is where I met her when I was researching a report on Germany and European defense. Previously, she was an advisor on disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation in the German Bundestag in Parliament, and she started her career as a researcher and lecturer at Bonn University in political science, contemporary history, and North American studies, and she's the winner of numerous fellowships and a board member of the German Atlantic Society and of Women in International Security, which I can thoroughly recommend if you don't know it, which is a brilliant network of women who are involved in different ways in international security policy, and an outfit with which I work as much as I can. So, since Russia invaded Ukraine in February, there's been a wave of announcements that suggest that Europe is finally getting serious about defense and about defense spending. The European Commission calculates that member states have announced plans for a total of 200 billion of additional defense spending on top of their existing budgets. The EU itself has committed 2.5 billion euros for the first time ever from its own off-budget European peace facility to support the Ukrainian armed forces, and most of that has been to pay for arms transfers from our own member states to Kiev. That was a watershed moment. Another watershed moment was the German Chancellor's foreign policy speech, what's become known as the Zeitenwende, the change of era, 3 days into the war, when he announced that Germany was no longer going to be naive about defense, and he notably announced that they were creating a 100 billion off-budget special fund to increase defense spending and specifically to buy lots of equipment. And I can tell you, having written a report about it in 2017, how disgraceful the state of the Bundeswehr is. You know, that they don't have boots, some of the soldiers, the helicopters don't fly, the frigates don't sail, many of the tanks don't roll, and you know, it's a national embarrassment, which they had to admit when the war finally erupted in Ukraine. The head of the German army himself said that he had almost no options to offer to the political leadership. We also have Nato, which has been very much revived by this conflict. It has announced plans to boost its high readiness forces in Europe from around 50,000 to 300,000. It has already sent more forward deployed forces to all of the countries of the eastern flank, including countries such as France, which had previously not taken a leading role there, and now taking a leading role in Romania. So increased presence in the East, increased defense spending, increased readiness, but all of these are, or most of these are announcements so far, rather than actual new capabilities. Most recently, in May, the European Commission and the High Representative here present announced the creation of a Defence Joint Procurement Task Force to support coordination and deconflict short-term arms procurement and coordinate as a clearinghouse cell for military assistance to Ukraine. And the Commission dangled 500 million euros from the EU budget over the next 2 years to reinforce the defense industrial capability of Europe through joint procurement. Great idea if it were to happen. The idea is then to have a European defense investment program established so that we create consortia for European defense capabilities, with the additional carrot of a value-added tax exemption as an incentive to buy jointly developed collaborative European weapons systems. The question with all this is, will it work? We've been, and I as a veteran in the media covering these things, I've been seeing those same charts for 25 years. The charts that show that we have 20 different kinds of tank and tracked vehicle, we have 14 different kinds of fighter aircraft, we have so many different kinds of helicopter, where the United States has, 1, 2, or 3. And it's clearly irrational for us to continue like this, but will it change? And that's what we're here to discuss today. And I have to say there are some grounds for skepticism. Same old, same old. Many of these are more announcements than actual spending so far. Where money is being spent, it's partly because our arms and ammunition stockpiles have shrunk as we've provided equipment to Ukraine. So France has given a quarter of all of its César long-range rocket system. And if you look at the Estonia, I think, has given almost 1/3 of all of its military equipment to Ukraine, out of an understanding of national self-interest, that Ukraine is fighting Estonia's war so that it doesn't come to Estonia. But, you know, the money that we will need to spend just to replace those stocks is considerable. Most of the immediate purchases that have been announced, correct me if I'm wrong, have been of equipment from the United States, not from Europe. Notably Germany buying F-35s and fighter aircraft and maritime patrol aircraft, the P-8s, and drones. Inflation, which we heard about this morning, is eating into defense budgets, and it's also eating into the announced increases in defense budgets. And it will cost more to borrow money for defense as well, so it's adding to that cost. The German Institute for Economics says now that Germany will never meet NATO's 2% spending target, despite the 100 billion in the defense fund. And some of the money in the defense fund, we're told, is actually being siphoned out of the defense, the permanent defense budget. And things that were supposed to be procured with the defense budget are now being bought with money from the defense fund. So there's a sort of three-card trick going on there. Hütchenspiel, I think you call it in German. And the big-ticket European collaborative defense programs are mostly stuck. The future air combat system is stuck, horribly stuck, in battles among industrialists, in battles between Paris and Berlin, in battles within Berlin with the Budget Committee. There's a rivalry between one system being developed by France, Germany, and Spain, and another system being developed by the UK, Italy, and Sweden. Now, the one thing I can tell you with certainty is that there will not be two European future air combat systems. There will either be one or there will be none. Take your choice. So, we've got a lot to discuss. My questions to Nathalie Loiseau first, and then we'll have a couple of rounds of questions to them, and then I want to leave plenty of opportunity for you to ask your questions as well. So start preparing your questions now. Nathalie, how do we ensure that this big wave of additional European defense spending unleashed by the war in Ukraine is spent rationally, in coordination, without duplication, on capabilities that really are essential for our common defense? Number one. Number two, is there a risk that we're actually preparing to fight the last war by investing in expensive platforms like fighter aircrafts and tanks that have long development cycles, rather than in cheaper and quicker weapons that have proved more effective in Ukraine's defense? Does it matter whether these capabilities are bought off the shelf from the United States and other manufacturers instead of through common procurement from European industries? And if so, how do we ensure that European production is timely and cost efficient, given the checkered history of European defense industrial collaboration? Over to you.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to participate in this conversation. We heard you, Paul, with your expected skepticism. And of course, if you've been working on European defense for decades, you heard a number of beautiful speeches and not necessarily so that many achievements. But there are three elements which may change the mindsets in Europe. The first one is that war has come back to our continent. You may argue that there was already war in the Balkans. Now we see, with no doubt, that Russia has an agenda of aggression using military means to achieve its objectives. It changes the mindsets of the political leaders, and political will be needed at every single step, and I will answer your questions. It also changes public opinions. During the process of the Conference on the Future of Europe, European citizens were asked what were their priorities as regards the European Union. And it was striking to see from different parts of Europe the expectations around European defense. Some of these expectations might not be realistic at this point, like a European army, but a sense that we live in an unpredictable world with unstable neighborhoods is very strong among our fellow citizens, and they expect the European Union to be able to do more. So we know that we have pressure from our citizens to do more. We did something we had not done before. We adopted, I would say, the first white book on European defense, which means that we shared our assessment of the threats that we are facing and the way we should answer these threats. And that's a step forward, because every single member state knows what the others do know, and you have more interest, for instance, for the eastern flank from countries like my home country, France, or Spain, or Portugal, and more interest into Sahel from countries like Estonia or the Czech Republic. So that's a change. But we've talked the talk, we have to walk the walk, and I know too well that beautiful speeches are not always followed by action. On the front of providing military equipment to Ukraine, we have not been that bad. 2.5 billion euros is significant. It was never done before to any of our partners. We decided in a fortnight to provide these equipments. And it's not only that we are refurbishing our stockpiles, it's also a form of solidarity. You would never have seen Estonia sending the equivalent to 1/3 of its military budget, or Poland sending so much military equipment, if the European Peace Facility was not funded massively by member states like France or Germany. So there's already a transfer helping these countries to be able to cope with their generosity and their interest in the war in Ukraine. But yes, we need to have more defense spending. Yes, we need to do more things in common, because everything you said is absolutely right. We have spent a lot of money, but in a very divided way, with some loopholes and some duplications that we have to avoid in the future. How do we do it? The Commission has only some incentives. It doesn't have a real power, because defense is still very much in the hands of member states. So we have to convince member states to plan in a coordinated manner. One of the big obstacles that we have been facing for years is the difference in planning of defense spending between member states. You may remember that a former German defense minister, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, had mentioned that we should not only have a joint combat air system, but also a joint ship system. And that sounded great, that sounded exciting, except that the planning of our different navies was completely different. So we have to sit around a table and make sure that we take decisions that are compatible. This is feasible. We have had the European Defence Agency for, I would say, ages. Now the Commission is trying to have more competences. And it will be needed at some point, exactly as it was with the absence of health policy before the pandemic, until we realized that we needed to purchase together health equipment or vaccines. Member states were challenged to keep the competence of health policies at a national level. And then it was obvious that we were stronger together, that we would buy cheaper and be more effective in a competitive world, and it started working. I think the same is happening in the middle of a crisis. You know the old saying that Europe makes progress in the middle of crisis. That was my fear as regard defense, and I have been repeating for years that if we were waiting for a crisis, it meant that we were waiting for a war to happen. Actually, this is what took place. We waited for a war to realize that joint procurement would be needed. It will still be a tough fight. We will work on it in the coming weeks and months. The European Parliament will push very much for it so that we are more effective. Then the question is, do we buy European? Do we have a Buy European Act? I would favor it at some point in the future, but we have to face the reality. Some of our military equipment are not ready for that, and we need on-the-shelf equipment. Every single army in the European Union buys from Europe and from outside Europe. It's not a big deal, but we have to realize that we cannot be dependent forever. Means that on drones we have lost a lot of time and we need to speed up. We need to work with the tools we already have, like the European Defence Fund, and it's good that we work on the weapons of the future. You said you were afraid that we would fight the last war, and it's always a fear. For instance, when we worked on the strategic compass, we were very much focusing on the evacuation of our nationals from Kabul and thinking how better to coordinate evacuation, how to be able to control a capital, an airfield, and have air transport to be able to evacuate all nationals. Will it be the next challenge? I don't know. But other other countries and competitors or adversaries are making technological progress, and we could not be left behind. Look at the money that is being spent in Russia. Look at the money that is being spent in China, and look at hypersonic missiles, for instance. It's not because a conventional war is back in Europe that we should forget about other sorts of warfare that we are facing at the same moment, in space, for instance, or that we should forget about freedom of navigation worldwide, which is part of our wealth and our well-being in Europe. So we have to be able to confront all these challenges together. It means spend more money, convince public opinions, but they are more or less more convinced than some of political parties, I have to say, at least in some countries. I will not comment on Germany because the other guests will do it much better than I do. I don't know if Germany needs to reach the 2%, actually, because when we reach the 2% in France, it includes nuclear deterrence. So have it in mind that 2% of the German GDP might be a lot. And if you are speaking about paying the right price and not wasting money, I have spent many years in the United States, especially during the war in Iraq. I am not certain that deciding on a level of spending is the best way to spend wisely. I'm certain that industrials, businesses love it. I'm certain that it's good for employment in the weapons industry. But it's not always the best way to spend wisely. I'm pretty certain that spending together is a good way to stop wasting money, wasting time, wasting research, and doing more with what we have.
Thank you very much, Nathalie, for those introductory remarks. I'll come back to you with some more questions afterwards. I'm tempted to say that Can we be assured that when the war in Ukraine is over, we won't still have the war between Dassault and Airbus?
Oh, well, competition is normal. It's in the DNA of businesses, and I would not blame businesses for being ready to compete. But indeed, there is a need for a political overlook on this sort of industrial projects. Airbus, Dassault, and all the others are used to have very special customers, which are nation states. These are their customers. So when we change the rules of the game, when we make it a European project, it changes a number of things. And you need time to adapt, to adjust. You need political will, and you need political follow-up. So there will be some drama moments. I have no doubt about it. But I have no doubt that we will make it, provided that our political leaders do realize that there is a strong need for being committed to these kind of projects.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to Jana Puglierin and ask you basically the same questions, but with a German flavor. Germany has made very big announcements. It's signed some contracts already. But first of all, how real is the Zeitenwende in defense? Does Germany have the capacity to absorb all these new weapons systems, to procure them? The procurement system has been a mess for decades. And secondly, where's Europe in all of this? So far, all I see is Germany buying off the shelf American systems, and I'm sure there'll be some German systems as well. But I'm missing Europe in all of this. Did I miss something?
Thank you very much for the questions, and thank you very much for coming here and listening to us. It's my first time in Santander. I've never been here before, and I'm completely struck by the beauty of the nature out there. And so I would prefer to be on the beach, so I admire you greatly that you took the time to come here and listen to us instead. And to make sure that you don't regret your decision, I hope that we will have an engaged conversation. I'm looking very much forward to your questions and comments and to discussing these things with you, because I think this is actually about us Europeans, about all of us. And I want to start with a caveat, because when I talk about European defense, as it is written in the title, for me that goes beyond the European Union. For me, European defense is about NATO, is about the EU, and is about multilateral cooperation. It is about different member states doing different things together. So all this contributes to European defense, and I think it is a big shame that in the past we have been looking at kind of European defense mostly in silos. So what NATO does, what the EU does, what the French do with their European intervention initiative, but we have not been able to really kind of have all hands on boards and to bring the European power that is available together. So just keep that in mind. When I talk European defense, I not only talk about the EU. And I want to make 5 points that we can then discuss later. I want to put the topic into a broader context. I want to tell you why I'm hopeful, despite everything that Paul has said, but then why I still think where we are is not enough and what we do is not sufficient. First thing is, I think that cannot be said enough, that traditional war is back in Europe. I mean, just kind of put yourself in the shoes of a Ukrainian soldier in the Donbass. What you see there is a scenario that in Europe you hadn't seen since the Second World War. Kind of 2 big land armies clashing with battle tanks in Europe. And from a German perspective, it's only 2 flight hours away, or 3 flight hours away, depending where you go. So I think I basically, for myself, still have to get used to this idea, because when I was born in '78 and when I grew up, I thought I would see, the world or Europe coming together and not being torn apart again. And this whole hope And I still remember the Berlin Wall coming down, and I still remember the early 90s. My grandmother is from Poland, so I still remember when Poland joined first NATO, and then kind of other countries of the former kind of Soviet bloc joined NATO. And it was a very emotional moment, and it was full of hope. And I just recently read the Charter of Paris again, and I saw how much hope there really was. So this is all in shatters now. The European security order, as we all knew it, and as we liked it, and as it was very comfortable for us Europeans, is in shatters. This is the end of an era. This is the end of the post-89 world, and there is no going back to where we've been previously. Even if we wanted to, I think on Russia's side, they have broken the contract, and there is no intention to obey to the established rules. Whereas there was kind of always hope that the world would become better, that Europe would become more and more secure for the recent years. I now think we're going into the reverse direction. We need to get used to the fact that we will see more conflict, maybe even more war, and that this conflict, and that brings me to my second point, will be under the threshold of, maybe real war. Conflict nowadays is also a feature of the cyberspace, information space. Energy, as I as a German can tell you, is used as a weapon. Migrants are used as weapons. And this is a new reality, and the Europeans need to adapt to it, and pretty quickly. There have been so many speeches talking about wake-up calls, but I think this time it's really crucial. I think it's really a make it or break it point, and I make that so clear because I think we need a lot of your support as kind of policymakers, as politicians, to really live up to the challenge. The world in Europe, or the ordinary life in Europe has become more dangerous, more contested, more conflictual than previously. And you might not feel it here, but you will feel it in the coming month, I'm sure. My third point is, so traditional war is back, but there is also a new means of warfare, weaponization of interdependence, a more conflictual order. And the third point is, and that brings me to hopeful things, NATO and the United States are back. And I think this is a game changer, basically, because under the Trump presidency, we all talked about NATO being brain dead, or not we all, but the French president more precisely, and basically the end of NATO and the dysfunctionality. With the Biden administration, we've seen the United States come back, and with this crisis we've seen, or with this war, we've seen NATO's comeback. But part of the truth is also that without the United States, NATO would not have been able and will not be able to adapt that quickly. So the truth is that when it comes to how we can defend ourselves as Europeans, today and for the foreseeable future, we cannot do this without the United States. That is because of the nuclear dimension and the US nuclear security guarantees, but also because of critical enablers and other capabilities. It's because of information sharing and the US intelligence. So without the US, we would not be able to, or we would not have been able to evacuate even our own people from Afghanistan. And I think we need to take this into account when we talk about doing more as Europeans or strategic autonomy and all this. At the same time, well aware that the clock in the United States is ticking. We are approaching the next elections. Forces that brought Trump into power are still prevailing. There is a high probability that he will be re-elected. So the US is both indispensable and maybe on the run at the same time, which puts us Europeans in a very difficult position. So I think our strategy here should be talking about buying off the shelf and American to try to get the American buy-in to European security as much as this is possible and to contribute to do our fair share, but to prepare for the moment when the United States might be changing their security posture. And I think, brings me to my fourth point, the EU is seizing the momentum. Nathalie has already explained a lot or talked about a lot of things, but I think the sheer fact that the European Union, a civilian power, now decided to give 2 billion euros to the member states, or kind of through the European Peace Facility, so that they can then equip Ukraine with European money, is really a mental game changer. That the EU does that would not have been possible just a couple of years ago. A lot of member states have committed to higher defense spending, including my country, but I just learned that in Spain this has been a quite heated debate as well, and that Spain wants to reach the 2% goal by 2029, and that you just have your own little Sondervermögen of 1 billion euros, not comparable with the German Sondervermögen, but still. So there are a lot of countries that want to join the club of the 2% spenders. What gives me hope, too, is that we don't only have more money, but that kind of the structure of European defense has become much clearer. And I think the strategic compass contributes significantly to this, because the EU is in no way trying to duplicate NATO or to compete with NATO when it comes to territorial defense. And I think this is actually very, very good, that it's now much clearer who does what, and that the idea is more to support each other. And I think the EU can support territorial defense within NATO pretty much through better defense procurement, through kind of European mechanisms enabling the Europeans to get better capabilities, which then can also be used in a NATO framework. That's at least my idea. And I think the EU has a tremendous potential to contribute to territorial defense also when it comes to resilience, making the EU more resilient when it comes to all the other sorts of attacks that are not kind of military attacks, but when it comes to information warfare, attack on our societies. What also gives me hope is that Finland and Sweden are joining NATO, and that Denmark is joining the EU defense, CSDP. So that shows me that the two organizations will inevitably be moving closer together, and there's this endless debate between Europeanists and Atlanticists might be less toxic, and both camps are much more united. What doesn't give me hope, or what worries me, is that I think we're trying to seize the moment, but it's still not enough. I'm afraid of a couple of things. First is what I call the reverse 2008 effect. In 2008, when the financial crisis has hit Europe, the back then 28 member states decided to cut defense spending individually, without cooperation, without coordination, which led to the result that we then had 28 basically bonsai armies, small little armies, and that kind of we were weakening ourselves tremendously. Now the reverse is possible. Every country just spends on whatever it thinks it's needed without any sort of cooperation. And I think that would be wrong, and that's why the EU efforts to streamline this are very much welcomed. I think there needs to be a fair balance between off-the-shelf and American products and strengthening the European industrial and technological base, because it's about knowledge. If we lose the ability to produce kind of the weapons for the future, because we lose the technological knowledge, we cannot even start to talk about strategic autonomy. So I think we need to strengthen our industry, our knowledge, but at the same time, there is a reason behind buying American, because it's about time, because the American equipment is available, and it's about refilling the shelves quickly. Another thing that worries me is that the experience with the existing European defense projects is so bad. From a German perspective, I mean, nobody knows how FCAS will end. At the moment, doesn't look too good. And I can tell you that when I talk to German parliamentarians, their appetite for future cooperation at this kind of scale is rather limited. So, yeah, enthusiasm looks differently. And the other big question is if the money is enough. And I think that is, from a German perspective, it's always hard to make this argument. We just decided to dedicate 100 billion euro extra money. But when you look at it a little closer, the money basically is like an ice cube melting in the sun. It seems like a big sum, but actually the 100 billion figure comes from kind of calculation that was done in the Ministry for Defense already in 2018. They were looking at what had Germany promised in NATO, but also in the EU framework, what was necessary, and where were the gaps. And they identified 200 billion euros that Germany needed to spend. 100 billion euros through the actual defense budget, but then there was this 100 billion euro gap. And that is why that number came up. So the Zeitenwende and what Olaf Scholz announced when it comes to the German Bundeswehr is actually an attempt to arrive in the 21st century, to arrive at 27th February 2022, and to enable Germany to fulfill the commitments that the German government has made years ago in NATO. It is not equipping Germany for the future. It is not, I hope it does both, but that is where the number comes from. When you look at inflation, when you look at how much kind of money creates money. So we buy a lot of new things, we have new personnel, but to maintain this is cost intensive. At the moment, the German plans freeze the ordinary defense budget at the status quo. And also the medium kind of defense planning scenario kind of doesn't show any change. So it seems like a very big move, but it's not clear how sustainable it is. And here comes the biggest challenge. It's spending the money wisely and for the EU, but it's kind of communicating now to the German population that we, in addition to the 100 billion, need a rise in the regular defense spending in the long run, because otherwise in 2027 we will be at square one again, not spending 2% and not being able to sustain our investments. And this is in times where we have high inflation, high energy prices, where people are struggling, and a lot of people ask me, so what about kindergartens? What about our infrastructure? What about pensions? What about everything? Why should we then spend even more money? But I think if you really think a scenario that the United States are leaving, maybe not leaving, but reducing significantly their contribution to European defense, 2% is cheap. And with that, I leave it.
Thank you very much. You've put a lot on the table there, and I think given us very good insights into both the context and what the German 100 billion means and doesn't mean. And I think that's a very useful clarification. I want to allow plenty of time for our friends in the room to ask us questions. So let me quickly put two or three more questions to you, if we can do it as quick a question and answer in the second round. One of the things that strikes me watching this is that there's been a coincidence of the war in Ukraine with the demise of Operation Barkhane in Mali. And that the result of that coincidence may be to put all of the focus back on territorial defense in Europe, to the detriment of the other security challenges that Europe faces and that require potentially expeditionary warfare operations. And also to put all of the focus back on NATO, which does territorial defense, to the detriment of European or coalition defense operations outside of the NATO area. So that's my first question. My second question, in all of this, we're not really talking about under what circumstances we might actually use any of this equipment that we're buying. So what are the red lines that would trigger a collective European or NATO military response? The use of a nuclear weapon? The use of other weapons of mass destruction? A hybrid operation against an EU or a NATO member state, for example, in the Baltic region? Where's your red line, and what would you do about it? And my third question, let's take a specific example. If armed conflict were to erupt elsewhere on the continent, let's imagine a new flare-up of political violence in Bosnia-Herzegovina, or between Serbia and Kosovo, or in Moldova. Which institution, the EU or NATO or some other coalition of the willing, should respond, and how? I'm going to reverse the order and ask Jana to go first this time. Give Nathalie a bit of thinking pause.
So I leave the hard questions to Nathalie and take the easy one here, because the question on crisis management, I think, is pretty easy. And it's about what is needed in theory and what member states do in practice. So in theory, or in reality, I would say, the United States, regardless who wins the next American election, is going to concentrate its efforts much more in the Indo-Pacific and on containing China. So what they have, kind of in terms of capabilities, but also attention-wise, for Europe is limited. Now it's all on Ukraine. It's not so much, and for a while already, on other hotspots in Europe's neighborhood. So we should not expect the United States to come to the rescue once there is another crisis in the Middle East or in Africa. Africa is something where the United States pretty much, I think, takes their hands off anyway. And I think if you look at the crises around Europe, and if you connect the dots and think the high bread prices, or high prices for everything, but especially bread, and think back at the beginning of the Arab Spring. One of the reasons why that happened was because of the bread prices back then in 2011. So the potential for escalation and future conflict in our southern neighborhood is growing by the day because of the side effects of the war and Russia's deliberate attempt to block grain exports, but also because of climate change, very much so. And so I think this is a ticking bomb, and it already had exploded several times. I mean, in Syria, the situation is still not really great, in Libya. And so I think there is a ticking bomb in our southern neighborhood. We try to not think about it too often at the moment, I think, because after Afghanistan and Mali, at least in Germany, the idea is, oh, these big military interventions, they failed. They don't have any positive result, and there is some truth to that. So I think we have a growing crisis area, and we have not good recipes what to do. And when it comes to crisis management operations, we have the reverse effect. So whereas I think the need for crisis management in the future is growing, the United States is less available, NATO will be less occupied with crisis management, refocusing fully on territorial defense. We have a track record when it comes to missions and operations that is not good. Member states, EU missions were much bigger in the past. They were shrinking in recent years, and the commitment of member states to contribute with personnel and capabilities was really limited. It was always hard to get enough volunteers, and that is true with regard to civilian missions, but also with regard to military missions. So I think crisis management is something that we have neglected for quite some time, but not because of resources, but also because we lack a good idea how a good crisis management operation could look like looking at Afghanistan and Mali not as exact blueprints for success.
Thank you. I thought we'd lost you for a moment, Nathalie, but you obviously just went to let Brexit out.
No, I was looking for a charger, but you will not get rid of me. So I'll try to answer your interesting and challenging questions. The first on expeditionary military forces. Even if we haven't really military forces abroad, they are more training missions or advisory missions. We are not very demanding on our military missions right now. You mentioned the coincidence between the war in Ukraine and the redeployment of Barkhane from Mali to Niger and other countries in Sahel. I would also mention the coincidence with the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, and I'm sure it was a signal that was well taken by Putin that there was very little American appetite to have boots on the ground, not only in Afghanistan, but elsewhere. And we all know that the first signal we got from the US as regards Ukraine was that there would not be militaries in Ukraine, American militaries. But you're right, we have sort of a deficit attention disorder. When we focus on Ukraine, do we realize that we are still busy in Iraq fighting ISIS? ISIS has been mostly defeated, but has not disappeared. And if there were no American and coalition forces there still fighting alongside with the Kurds, you would have ISIS remnants coming again and threatening not only the Middle East, but also Europe. Sahel is another example. Libya is a place which will not ask for permission to go back into chaos at any time. And you mentioned the Balkans, and rightly so. I would warn us not to cry wolf at every provocation, because some political leaders in the Balkans are very good at provocations. But so far, it's, and rightfully so, it's more political than military, but we have to be ready. Whether it would be NATO or EU, I'm thinking of Bosnia, where we have a big and useful military mission, EU Althea. We'll have a challenge with the renewal of the mandate in the UN Security Council. And that's a weapon, a diplomatic weapon for countries like Russia, permanent members of the Security Council, whether they will allow for the continuation of the mandate of EU Althea, whether they will put conditions, remains to be seen. Optimists will say that they would certainly prefer to have EU in Bosnia than to have NATO. But realists, as I am, will say that they will probably try to make us dance around the story and see whether they can benefit from something. The question on the presence of NATO or EU in the Balkans is less about the United States and more about Turkey. And Turkey is an elephant in the room we have not been mentioning. You may remember that when Emmanuel Macron did his famous quote on NATO brand dead, he was, of course, thinking on the comments made by Donald Trump on NATO. But he was also thinking about difficulties we were facing between NATO members like Greece and Turkey. And it's not completely over. So this is one more question mark we're having. We are having it in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, but we might have it in the Balkans. And this notion that some countries still have, like Russia, but also like Turkey, of spheres of influence, this very old-fashioned notion has come back to the table. And we have to keep it in mind when we decide who is in charge and who is doing something. Might also be a coalition of the willing. I mean, no matter if the cat, and not the Brexit cat, is black or white, it has to catch mice. And that's the most important. And as we have, for the moment, ended up this useless quarrel about Atlantists against Europeans. I think it's not that important. On red lines, well, there are different things in your question, Paul. On nuclear, of course, I will not answer. The importance and the use of deterrence is that you never tell what is your red line as long as nuclear deterrence is at stake. You simply say exactly what Vladimir Putin says, that if you have existential threats, you might use it. But he also reminded what we all say, that a nuclear war cannot be won, so it could not be fought. So no mention of red lines as long as nuclear is concerned, because that's the principle of deterrence. Unconventional, well, Article 5 and Article 42.7. And let's face it, there has been no real conventional threat against any NATO member or EU member since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, which make me say that our predecessors in maybe not in 28, but certainly in 2014 after Euromaidan were wrong to keep Ukraine outside of NATO. This notion that the open door policy was the right move is debatable, because it was not an open door policy. It was to leave Ukraine at the door. Had Ukraine been in NATO in 2014 after Euromaidan, there would not be a war in Ukraine right now. And as long as hybrid warfare is concerned, well, war has already started. It's not a threat. It's a war that's taking place. Cyber attacks, disinformation, elite capture, corruption of political leaders is something that has been used by Russia for many, many years against the West, against Europe, against the UK, against the US, and we are still in it, and we have to realize it and fight against it. First, expose what's taking place. I'm publishing a book in the coming weeks about this invisible war that we are in, but we are already in. And we have to be able to expose it, to show solidarity, to use the means of the European Union, where you have migrants used as a tool, or energy or food or whatever. And we have to take countermeasures and not to be shy to name what's taking place and to respond if necessary. So this is basically my answers. And on the Balkans, I think we should focus even more on diplomacy, on conflict prevention. We are doing some things, but we should do more. We should avoid losing our times, for instance, in trying to change the electoral law in Bosnia, and focus more on making sure that it's a free and fair election that is taking place, and that we deter any ethnic leader to try to destabilize this region. Not only thinking that Russia might be behind these leaders, and remembering that they do that themselves quite a lot of chaos. And it's not outside Europe, it's not in our neighborhood, it's in the center of Europe.
Nathalie, thank you very much. Well, now it's your turn. You've been very patient, and audience, so it's your chance to throw your questions at the panel. Can I see, I'm going to take sort of say 3 questions at a time, and I'm in favor of positive discrimination in favor of women, because we had only male voices in this morning's questions, so I will give priority to women if there are women hands in the room. Apologies in advance to anybody that offends. So far, I only see male hands. I see a woman hand back there. Can we have a microphone, please? Because the questions, I presume, will be in Spanish. Sorry, I've seen the gentleman there. I've got 2 gentlemen here, and I've got a lady in the back there. Is there a microphone, please? There is indeed a microphone. Madam, can you stand up so that he can find you with the microphone?
Hello, my name is Laura. First of all, thank you so much for being here, for all of the information. And my question is so precise, but since you mentioned the Balkans and EU or NATO being in Bosnia, I was curious to know, what do you think that the Balkans or some countries might prefer to have there? Because it's like NATO bombed Belgrade, but I mean, it's like the EU didn't do that much, at least at the beginning, and they created a conference to try to help, but nothing happened. So when I talk to people from the Balkans, they are sometimes a bit disappointed at how the EU behave and also how enlargement is going, how slow, and I don't know. I'm curious to know what you think.
Thank you. Next question.
Well, my name's Annabelle. It's just quite basic question. I want to know, to what extent should we worry about that potential threat of Russia or Belarus attacking any NATO member? I mean, I know it's a bit basic, but I just want to know. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. There's no such thing as a stupid question. There are only stupid answers. Right. Now we can allow one male question, and that I recognize the gentleman in the front row. And please feel free to ask your questions in Spanish.
Okay. First, I want to apologize because I feel like I'm going to talk about divorce in a wedding, but my question is related with Brexit. Concretely about the role of European non-EU member states in European defense. You think it should be limited to NATO? So the UK should be for us like Canada is, for example? Or shall the EU be open to special collaboration with the UK or Norway, not only, for example, in programs like, for example, the Galileo program, which the UK has shown a little bit of interest at least? Thank you very much.
I'm going to abuse my privilege of the chair to give you my own answer on that as well, as somebody who is Franco-German and therefore Franco-British and therefore totally schizophrenic. But the first question, Nathalie.
Yes, thank you for these very good questions. I will start with the Balkans. Are people in the Balkans disappointed with the EU? Probably, and for both good and bad reasons. Good reasons because, well, we did a lot to end the war in 1995. We did a lot to provide with subsidies, advice, and with an accession process for at least Serbia and Montenegro. But it's not going quite fast. That's true. And I have to say that except Germany, which is making quite a lot of business in the Balkans, and Austria, which has an obvious interest in the Balkans, we don't see that many member states doing things in the Balkans, and they should be much more present. But this disappointment comes also from bad reasons. There is an accession process, and it is demanding for good reasons. You have to keep up with the European values of rule of law, fight against corruption, before you enter the EU. Otherwise, when we face the same sort of problems with members of the EU, like Hungary, for instance, it's much more difficult to address it. So yes, the EU is demanding, and for good reasons, and that should be a plus for the citizens of the Balkans. And sometimes citizens of the Balkans even blame us for not being demanding enough towards their own leaders, because they see corruption, they see money being captured, and they hope that we ask for accountability. And of course you have disinformation. You have Russia and also China and sometimes Turkey or countries from the Middle East trying to portray EU as a boring partner, always asking for reforms and not providing sufficient support. And then you have third countries coming with loans and wonderful projects and saying, well, just sign at the bottom of the page and you'll see how wonderful the world will be. And it happened with Montenegro until the moment they were in debt with China to an indecent level. It happened elsewhere. You have Chinese workforce working in Serbia with joining working law and not Serbian working law. So you have all these sort of things. We should be much more present, much more active. We should communicate much better. And we should believe ourselves much more in the European future of the Balkans, because they will not change their geography. So better having them within the European Union, better being ready to welcome them. It means that we have to change our governance and making sure that they are ready to join. Not speeding up the process, but making sure that there are continuous progress and it's going in the right direction. And as regards bombing of Belgrade and these sort of things, well, this is Russian narrative. They are very happy about it, saying, well, look what NATO did. NATO is not a friend of the Serbs or of the Balkans. You will never hear the same thing in Macedonia, for instance. Well, third countries are playing with it. But the actual threat of Russia attacking NATO members, militarily, well, let's face it, the Russian army is not what it was portrayed to be before the war in Ukraine. It's facing trouble, much more trouble than expected. And I don't imagine Russia opening a new front elsewhere. But remember what I mentioned about hybrid threats. It's already attacking us with energy, with food, and with disinformation. So we have to face it and we have to respond about it. And what do we do with European non-EU member states? I'm sure, Paul, you're thrilled to answer the question. Unfortunately, when we signed the political declaration with the UK on Brexit, Boris Johnson at the time had included foreign policy and defense among the topics that we would sign an agreement about. And then when we worked on the trade and cooperation agreement, he was not interested anymore to have anything substantial with the EU or even with member states separately. I do hope that seeing what has happened with the war in Ukraine, seeing how we are coordinating our efforts, military efforts and efforts on sanctions, many people in the UK now realize that we are doing a good job and the job could be even better if there was a framework for this cooperation in place, because we are still wasting time to adjust to a sanction regime from the other side, from the UK to the EU and vice versa. And it should be even more effective, especially because the UK is very good at sanctions regime. So I do hope that we keep it as something to be done in the near future.
Thank you. Jana, you don't have to answer all of the questions if you think Nathalie has addressed them, but please give us your thoughts.
Maybe I just concentrate on where I disagree or where I want to add something. On the Western Balkans, I think I understand why there is a lot of frustration. I think that most of the countries feel like they are stuck in a holding pattern. They are in the waiting room forever. There is no motivation and political will in the EU to let them in. And they feel betrayed. And I completely see that. And looking at, for example, a country like Bulgaria, who holds North Macedonia, I think, hostage for internal, like domestic political reasons, I can understand all sorts of frustrations. I think we cannot afford to lose the Western Balkans, but I think it's not only about the Western Balkans, it will be also about at least Ukraine and Moldova. It's about enlargement whenever it will take place in the far distant future and the candidate status, but it's for me, it's about how to make the path more attractive for those countries that are waiting to join. And I would think along those lines, how to open the single market more to those countries than we already do, everything but institutions, and how can we even increase our cooperation when it comes to climate and energy cooperation, and kind of already think the Western Balkans and think Ukraine and Moldova when we think about our energy transformation and the Green Deal, and to include them, thinking about them as possible members. Second, I completely agree with Nathalie on the prospect or the likelihood of an attack on a NATO member. I don't see that coming in the near future. There is this scenario that you very often hear, at least in Germany, kind of if Russia is really pushed to the corner, they will escalate nuclear and they will kind of throw a nuclear weapon just to scare the Western world to death and just to make sure that the West takes hands off. I don't think that is very likely, but I cannot give you 100% certainty that this will never happen. I think it is a scenario that we need to think about, but I would not think that the probability is very high. And on the UK, I think the EU has done a mistake. Maybe it was inevitable with this British government, but I was very much in favor of creating more attractive docking mechanisms on the EU side. For me, it is basically, coming back to this picture of European defense, fragmented picture of European defense that I alluded to in the beginning. So the EU is just one player amongst others. There are a lot of coalitions of the willing emerging. Some countries have a huge interest in those coalitions of the willing, much more than in working through the institutions, because it's time-consuming to work in the EU framework. It takes forever. You have to make concessions. Countries like, for example, France, like to work in coalitions of the willing, as in the Strait of Hormuz or Takuba in Africa. The United Kingdom is very much on board with this because they want to work on a flexible basis with other Europeans. So if the EU is not attractive and is not creating attractive docking mechanisms, I think you will see more and more of these unilateral, bilateral frameworks, and I think this will undermine the cohesion of the European Union. That's why I think it's in the EU's interest to have attractive docking mechanisms. I unfortunately have to admit that this current government in the UK is not interested in anything. My bet is on time. I hope that the United Kingdom will come to its senses, but that the EU will also open up more and when it comes to its precious defense market and cooperation. The UK, just look at what the UK does in Ukraine at the moment. I think we cannot afford to not work as much as possible, and wherever it is possible with the UK, in every single framework, including in the EU.
Well, I agree so much with Jana that I probably don't need to add a lot anyway. But let me say, I think it was a short-sighted mistake by the EU to have made the Galileo project the first issue on which the UK was punished for Brexit. It may have been inevitable because divorce is almost the worst moment, and the EU itself felt threatened in its existence at the time, and therefore had to do something symbolic to show that Brexit had leaving the EU had a high price. But the fact is that this damaged Galileo or withdrew capability from the Galileo, as well as damaging the EU, the UK. It created bad blood, and that bad blood has persisted. I agree with both speakers that under the current British government, there's really no prospect. The most we can hope is that they stop continuing to dig the hole, and therefore we're going to have to wait for a future, I would say probably a future non-conservative government, whether it could be a coalition with conservatives, but certainly not a conservative-only government, before we can start to rebuild. But what I would really recommend is to stop burning the bridges in the meantime, to keep as many doors open as possible, because the fundamental question which we as Europeans in the EU must ask ourselves is, are we better off with Britain as part of Europe's defense industrial and technological base, or are we better off with the UK drifting off to the American military-industrial complex? And I think that question, as they say in America, is a no-brainer. And a lot of our companies, including defense companies, are still intertwined. Think of MBDA, the missile maker. Think of Airbus. There are so many links that are still there, but which could be broken if this divorce goes on and gets worse and worse. So let's, first do no harm or do no more harm, and let's second start thinking, planning for the day when we'll be able to do some good. And I have some thoughts on how we could do that. Now, I have another joker to pull out of my chairman's magic top hat, which is that we're going to ask Josep to give us a little his final thoughts on this conversation. But we've got time for one more round of questions from the floor and answers from our panelists before he does. So this is your moment. And again, women's hands count double. That's not a woman. Even I can see you've got a beard, sir. There's a lady here in the front.
Hi, I'm Elisa. I wanted to ask you about the proposal of the European Parliament about the 29th article about facilitating the sanctions, and if you believe it's possible, or if it will go forward or it will fail.
I think you'll probably need to start by explaining to most of the room what the 29 proposal is. It's a little bit arcane. Thank you for the question. Other questions? Here, the gentleman in the front and the gentleman to the left, since I see no more ladies, but if I've got you wrong. Yeah? And then there's some more. I've got him. Yeah, you and then you.
Una pregunta a Nathalie y otra a Borrell.
One question for Nathalie and another one to Borrell. Are we waging a war or not? Is the expenses military or Nathalie, we want to study history, and we have to see that one of the causes of the Nazi army was the dispersion of the weapons. What is important is that these weapons should be European and with European technology, I think.
You got it, okay. Right.
No, for Nathalie.
That was for Nathalie. So, this gentleman here. No, just right next to you. Senor.
Well, thank you very much. My question is about a recent subject that has been discussed in the European institutions and between precisely Germany, France and Spain, and it's the MidCat, which Olaf Scholz launched again after 3 years stopped, and there has been an opposition from France, and I want to know your opinion about if this is a responsible position in the situation, in the political situation in the whole Europe, and if there are any possibilities of developing this project as the German and Spanish government are trying in the following months. Thank you.
Sorry, which program is this?
MidCat, the gasoduct in the Pyrenees through.
Yeah, okay, right, the gasoduct, right. Yeah, okay. Not strictly a defense question, but we won't let Nathalie off for that reason. Okay, Nathalie, go first, please.
Well, thank you. On sanctions, the European Union can decide sanctions, including when there are violations of human rights. The very problem we are having today, there are two problems. The first is that to decide sanctions, there is a need for unanimity in the among the 27. And you've seen that the tougher the sanctions as regards Russia are, the more Hungary is dragging its feet. It's not a surprise, and it's not the first time that one single member state can be a sort of a Trojan horse for a third state which is not willing to be targeted. So there's definitely a need to make a change and get rid of unanimity in foreign policy, especially as regards sanctions. And I would also add that the other problem is that we can target countries or individuals for violations of human rights. We should also target them for corruption, because very often both go hand in hand, and that would be a useful tool for the European Union. The second question, better to have weapons in common, because weapons in the hand of a nation state is always something that people fear would bring us back to the horrors of the 20th century. That's right. But you need political will for this, which is not always easy. So the European Defence Fund is very helpful to push companies and member states to work together, and making sure that they bring their brains, their means together to have weapons. But at the end of the day, so far, the customer, the client, will still remain member states, nation states. So we are not there yet completely. And the last question on MICAS. I know it's important. I know a country like Spain is very much in favor of it. And especially in the context of getting rid of Russian gas, it might sound smart to encourage other gasoducts bringing gas from other parts of the world. But at the same time, you cannot say that it's a green project. We don't only intend to get rid of Russian gas, but we intend to get rid of gas. And should we invest a huge amount of European money into something that is not green, remains to be seen. So this is at least my personal position. I'm not saying it's the position of my member state, but I'm an MEP. So that's how I see it, and that's how I vote about it in the European Parliament. Not only let's get rid of Russian energy, but let's not forget that we have a target of zero emission in 2050, and that we should go green and get clean until 2050, before 2050.
And this, of course, has nothing to do with French protectionism about protecting EDF and preventing too much energy from being exported across the Pyrenees to France, right? So if it was electricity, if it was electrical power lines, you'd be in favor?
Interconnections. There was this position of EDF for years, you're right, but it changed when I was in the government, actually. We did a summit with Spain and Portugal to enhance the connections between Spain, Portugal, and France. But as regard gas, my position as being maybe sometimes greener than a green is not to lose focus on what we have.
Those questions were all to Nathalie, but Nathalie, I have a question to you, because I did not understand something properly, because you talked about sanctions and the need for unanimity. But isn't it the case that once the sanctions regime has been established by all 27, you can go to majority voting? There was this kind of that proposal already when we talked about sanctions in Belarus, this idea that one could just do it, and it's more a political question whether it's about unanimity, because I mean it would be in an existing sanctions framework, no? Just on the, but there would be legal ground for majority vote. Just to understand it better, because that's what when I studied majority voting and where and when it's possible, that's what my impression was.
And if I could add a question, is there any possibility to circumvent Hungary by simply going outside the treaty and doing it by intergovernmental agreement among the other member states? Because that would really call Hungary's bluff and devalue its veto within the EU.
Well, it's always possible, Paul. You can decide sanctions without being in the framework of the European Union. But very often, sanction regimes have an impact on the functioning of the single market. So you have better to have everybody on board. And quite often as well, you have to compensate the effects of the sanctions towards the member states which are more a European framework. But we had already thought about it when there was this risk that Hungary would veto an additional package of sanctions, whether we would be able to have an intergovernmental system, both of sanctions and of solidarity. This is always feasible, but it's always heavier, let's say it. And to answer your question about does everything has to be decided out of unanimity as regards sanctions? Normally, no. But the level to which the Political and Security Committee of the EU is monitoring the implementation of sanctions, as well as the level to which they are monitoring CSDP missions, for instance, is excessive, which means that very often the Council, the 27, want to have their say on every single detail. And I'm sure that if you ask Josep about it, he will agree with me that as soon as a principle is decided out of unanimity, the rest should be given either to EES or the Commission or to majority voting, instead of having this very heavy control of every single small decision, which doesn't make us efficient. And to come back to what you were saying before, this is what makes the EU decision-making process unattractive.
Thanks very much. We've had a very rich discussion. Thank you, and I apologize to a couple of gentlemen at the back of the room who weren't able to ask their questions. But okay, Joseph says we're going into extra time. It's injury time at this point. We're not yet in extra time. So there are two gentlemen, one there and one on each side of the aisle. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you very much for the very interesting question and discussion. My question is related to finance. We heard today about the off-budget 2.5 billion of the peace facility, also about the commitment of member states to spend the 2% of the GDP in defense, also about joint procurement. But what about our own EU budget? I mean, we have a budget, a new MFF that will be running until 2027, that was clearly designed for the good old peace times, while now we are facing clearly new challenges and priorities with an MFF that allocates, if I'm not mistaken, only 13 billion euros to security and defense, being, by the way, the smallest chapter on it. So my question is, and I think it's more for Nathalie, what is the real margin of maneuver of the EU to amend or adapt this budget? Thank you.
There is, of course, a mid-term review built in, but next question, sir. Final question.
Thank you very much. Fabrice Potier from former NATO head of policy planning, now running with Anders Fogh Rasmussen, a consulting firm called Rasmussen Global. And we have been asked by President Zelensky to work on a pro bono basis on thinking through what sort of security defense guarantees the international community could offer to Ukraine so that it won't happen again. And that my question is connected to that. I felt the debate today is interesting but very nombrilistic, very Europe-centric. And it falls short of answering the key question about all of that for what? And I think some of the intervention alluded to that. All of this European defense to achieve what exactly? And at the core of it is, how do we define European security? And I think here, even though there is a broad consensus across Europe that we are no longer in a peacetime state. Now we're in a crisis state, in a kind of open-ended crisis state. The question is, how do we end it, and therefore how do we define European security? And interestingly here, member states are pretty divided. Some define it at the border of Poland. Some defines it actually at the border of Ukraine, the eastern border of Ukraine, and others, including, I think, still in France, define it in all the way to Vladivostok. And answering that question is pretty fundamental, and at the core of it is what kind of support will the international community, especially the Europeans, give to the Ukrainians so that we will not see a third war occurring on Ukrainian soil within the next years or decades. And here, I think there is a key question asked also to the European defense project, which is barely playing catch-up with the European needs, but actually also has to be able to fill some of the Ukrainian needs, because the assumption, at least we are working on behalf of President Zelensky, is the best defense guarantee for Ukraine is self-defense. But the best self-defense is one that is enabled by international donors to a very large extent. Do we have the money, and do we have the will for that? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Sorry, Fabrice, with your beard and the distance with my eyesight failing, I hadn't spotted you. The bad news is we've lost Nathalie Loiseau, who regrets she had to cut off because she has another commitment immediately. The good news is I think we've got Josep to try and answer, at least in part, Fabrice's very far-reaching question as to what future security guarantees we can give to Ukraine and how we develop our defense efforts so as to do that. But Jana, I'm going to ask you to have a final thought on that before and on the previous question.
Yeah, first on the EU budget, I couldn't agree more. I was very sad to see that it was cut in, the money for the EDF was cut in half in the last budget, and the money for military mobility even more so. So yes, I think there needs to be more money for defense in the EU budget. I think there are a lot of people already making this argument, but it is as always when it comes to the EU budget. My big fear is that once the war ends, and I don't see that coming in the near term, but I see a scenario where Russia has an interest in a ceasefire, not to create peace, but to refresh its own forces, to regroup, and then to wage an attack maybe later next year in spring again. I see a huge danger that once the security situation in Europe seems to be more stable than it is at the moment and the actual fighting ends, priorities will be different again. I hope they won't. People like I try to, I don't know, to say at every occasion when talking to the broader public why this is needed, but that is my fear. And when it comes to Ukraine, I'm even more pessimistic, Fabrice. I think there is no consensus in NATO what to do with Ukraine. I think we are nearing a European security architecture with three camps, with the West, traditional EU, NATO, Russia, Belarus, and whoever is in that camp, and then a contested space in between, like it was previously. I think it would be a huge mistake to not do more for Ukraine and Moldova at least, but I don't buy it yet. If you ask me, but not kind of without looking at the real situation, I would argue for what I said before about enlargement, bringing Ukraine and Moldova closer to the single market, giving them more access, doing kind of climate and energy projects with them, but also at ECFR, colleagues have argued for security compact with Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova already prior to the war. And I would also be in favor of security guarantees, meaning us saying clearly, kind of defining red lines and saying if that if X happens, then we do that. But I don't see that emerging. Maybe I'm too pessimistic.
The good news is that we had Nathalie back. The bad news is we've lost her again. So unless she reappears within the next 10 seconds, I'm going to pass the floor to Josep. And as a little filler, I think I would say that I don't think that fundamentally those countries that thought it was a bad idea to bring Ukraine into NATO before the war have changed their opinion. I don't see any country that has said, I was wrong, we should have brought them in before, and now we should bring them in. So I presume that that division will continue, and that the security guarantees that can be offered to Ukraine will not be include NATO membership.
Or be near Article 5.
But you know, they may be as close to Article 5 as you can come from individual countries such as the UK, the US, at least under a Biden administration, but not necessarily under a Republican one. Although the Republicans as a party have been pretty strong in supporting Ukraine during this war.
But Paul, if the United States wanted to give an Article 5 guarantee to Ukraine, wouldn't they do things differently even, I mean, just now, they say clearly that they have red lines in terms of what they deliver, what kind of weapon systems. They say they are not at war with Russia, and they are really careful in their approach.
And they don't want World War III, absolutely, yeah.
I don't see that.
No, nor do I, and I think that will remain. And I must say that my personal view is that NATO made a mistake in opening the door in the first place to Ukraine and Georgia, because they made a promise they couldn't deliver, and that makes NATO look weak and undermines some of its the trust that people can have in it. And it created illusions for those countries and led to wars that in which we were unable to come, or unwilling to come to their direct defense. But that's my personal view for what it's worth. So we've now come to the pièce de résistance. We're in extra time, and we're bringing on our star substitute striker. Josep, the floor is yours. Tell us what you've taken away from this discussion.
Well, I don't know why everybody started speaking English.
Sorry.
You have to speak English, but all others, it is no more translation from English to Spanish to English?
Yes.
Yes, it is, no? So make the interpreter to work instead of speaking bad English, all of you, no?
Your English is not bad.
No, bueno, para mí
Well, in fact, for me, this exchange of ideas has been a way of seeing what are the views regarding all these things. We were supposed to be speaking about European defense after the Ukrainian war, but we've talked about almost everything else. We've talked about sanctions, we've talked about what's happening with budgets, we've talked about the red lines and things that are not so much linked to the first idea. And in fact, we say after the Ukrainian war, but we don't know if that means after the war is ended or after the war has started. So let's suppose it means after the war has started and there is a war. What's clear to me is that in the last 20 years, European defense and European armies trying to do something jointly have fundamentally carried out missions abroad. Training missions in Sahel, which is one of the typical examples, or even participations in missions in the NATO framework in Afghanistan. And throughout this time, the European armies have lost great military capacity. In Europe, we've had a disarmament process, a silent but very effective process. The missions abroad, we cannot say were a success. Isn't that true? We cannot say that Afghanistan was a success after $1 trillion spent in I don't know how many years of war. The day we celebrated the anniversary of not being present in Kabul anymore, that's when France decides that they're going to leave Mali. So we cannot say that these missions have been a success, neither in Afghanistan nor Iraq nor the Sahel. But when we speak about European defense or the capacity of Europeans of defending themselves through their armies, the public opinion needs to know that the armies are now smaller and smaller, and we've talked about bonsai armies, and that is true. They've been reduced in a spectacular manner. It was the chief general of the French state, and France is one of the few countries that has taken seriously defense, and the UK more than anyone else. That's why they're not with us anymore, but those that have taken it more seriously, General Boucard in France says to the French MPs things that are quite impressive. For example, he says the number of warships of the French fleet is half of what we had in 1990. So in 30 years, the French fleet has been cut in half. More than a bonsai army, it means that it's really reduced in size. The French army has lost 30% of its combat planes. That's 30% less. And from the viewpoint of ammunition, stocks are almost finished because of the supplies we've provided to Ukraine. And it's not me saying so, but the general says so before the French MPs in their parliament, that we don't have almost no ammunition. We've lost 30% of the planes and half of the ships. If that's not a disarmament process, then what is it? And this is the people that have taken defense more seriously. And for example, in the past, if we ask about what's happened in Germany, Spain, and so on and so forth, the situation is even worse. So that's the issue that Europeans need to reflect on. We now speak about developing military capacities once again. As you know, I am the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security and Defense, Therefore, this is part of my agenda and my portfolio and is one of my concerns, and maybe it's not present enough. Because if we now say that we want to rearm ourselves, that means that we stop the disarmament process and have capabilities again. So there's only two things I have to say to European citizens. First of all, we need to start with the industry. It doesn't make sense to try and have a strategic military autonomy if you don't have military industry. If you don't have the military industry and you need to purchase your weapons from others, then you don't have much autonomy. So we need to make an effort to develop the military industry in a joint manner. Airbus has been a big European success, and this is something we do between all the different European countries involved. But what we've done for civil aviation and for communication satellite systems is something that we should be able to do so too with military industry. We need to develop the military industry. And I know that people would prefer to develop the industry of cured meat because it always looks better than manufacturing warplanes. But if you want to have a defense capacity, you have to develop the industry, but not on a national foundation. Let's cooperate industrially. And that is what the Commissioner Breton will explain, because he is in charge of the Fund for Defense. And it should be called the Fund for the Defense Industry, because the Commission doesn't have any powers in the defense, but it does have in industry. So these are two very different things, even though they are related. Secondly, if each European state increases its military capacities according to what they have and now, they all increase what they have and they broaden their capacities. I don't know if I'm explaining themselves in a proportionate manner, then the result will be a waste of resources. A big waste of resources and misuse, because we will increase the duplicities that already exist, and we won't fulfill what is lacking and the gaps that we have, and there's many. So we have a lot of many things amongst all, but then we also have nothing of other things. We don't have refueling, for example, nor drones. We didn't have them in the Libya war, and we still don't have them. So if we just increase what we already have, we won't have what we need. So that's how it works. If you increase only and you focus on what you already have, then we won't have what we are lacking. So we need to do together what we don't have, refueling and drones, which is the typical example. And we have too much of some of the military capacities, and let's please not increase them and reduce them, in fact. And that's the military architecture operation that we should carry out as Europeans. But politically it's very difficult, because we're looking into basic aspects of sovereignty, like the organization of armies, the kind of army in each country, and that someone comes and says you have too many tanks, but not enough, ships or whatever. Or the other way around, and we need to make an effort so that together we can have interoperable military capacities that provide us a joint strength. So we have 10 bonsais, and the 10 bonsais are still double the size. They will just be double the size, but worthless. And that's not the solution. The solution is to go from several bonsais to having some pine trees. So let's not make the bonsais double in size. We need bigger trees. And this is something very difficult at a political level, because you have to say to some of them, no, you already have too much of this, shouldn't manufacture more of this, but more of that. If we all continue working in a disorganized way, in the way in which the reduction was carried out, because the reduction was also something not organized. We all cut in the places where we decided to cut, but that's not coherent. So if we increase capacities in the same way in which we reduce them or cut them, it will be once again worthless, and we will spend a lot of money, and we will create redundant capacities, or we will have elements that are useless. And this is something that has to be carried out by the Council of Defense Ministers through the European Defense Agency, that every year asks how are European armies, what do they have, what they don't, what should they have. and we try to orient an action that goes through submitting national sovereignties to a supranational view. And this, of course, is very difficult. But if we don't do it, we won't know how we're able to progress. That's the political issue. But if the war in Ukraine has been useful, well, it demonstrates that the armies that haven't been very efficient for political reasons, that is another total discussion, don't have the capacities of carrying out a war. It doesn't seem that they would be able to do so. This has to be done inside the framework of NATO, because I insist on this. There's no alternative for territorial defense of Europe than NATO. And no one pretends for this to be otherwise. But Europeans should have the capacity of joining our forces and making them interoperable, so that they can be deployed jointly in missions, so that we can attend problems that NATO is not going to solve. Because NATO is not going to solve absolutely all of our problems. And depending on who is in government in the US, they won't solve any of our problems.
You might say, well, you will have the battle groups and the combat groups that are in standby. Why it hasn't worked? Why you did not use them? Why do you think that your rapid intervention forces are going to be swifter? It is maybe another matter, another issue we can address. If you have Alpine armed forces, if you go to Congo, you won't do a thing with these forces, because they won't be adapted to to Africa. Or if you have a mission, I don't know, with troops to fight in Congo, and you have to go to Libya, it won't be the same. So you have to have troops adapted to the terrain, to the missions. As the military says, it is the mission that determines the force, and not the force that is going to determine the mission. So you have to if you have a mission, you have to find a force adapted to the mission. You need to have the capacity that enables you to adapt the forces to the mission, and that's what we have to do. And that's what the member states will have to demonstrate they are able to do. So the first answer to the Ukraine war, we will see it very soon, when the member state will respond to the petitions of Brussels for having at their disposals the military units that are able to address certain kind of missions, and some of them will have a relation with the Ukraine war. That's why I'm answering to your question. We are not in war. We are not participating in this war, and I hope we won't be waging that war, because if we were in that war, it wouldn't be a small war, and so I wouldn't like to imagine the situation. Tomorrow, when we will see the situation of the Ukrainian war, you will understand better what I mean by this. But Europeans have to understand that they need to have defense capacity that they do not have now currently. And if they want to have them, they have to build them in a coordinated way, and that's the message.
I think you have two perhaps unwanted allies. One of them is Vladimir Putin, and the other one is Donald Trump, or the specter of Donald Trump's return. But I think your biggest problem remains getting the political will of the leaders of our member states to actually bite the bullet, take the tough decisions. If I were you, I would try to lock them in a room, perhaps starting with some of the bigger member states that have the biggest defense industries, and find some way of convincing them that they have to make this a Chefsache, as the Germans say. They have to take control themselves. Nobody else can tell the military, no, you've got to have it to the same specifications. No, you've got to have it on the same timetable. No, you can't have extra bells and whistles. One weight of plane, not 5 weights of planes. One size of helicopter, and these sorts of things. This is what has killed European Defence Cooperation in the past. I wish you success. Thank you to Jana and to Nathalie, who sadly had to leave us. Thank you for your questions, and I'd like you to join me in thanking the panelists.